what has emerged to explain the metabolic effects of these three FGFs with the same receptors, FGFR4, FGFR1, that can be mitogenic with cellular FGFs. Clothos, which are named after the three Greek mythological goddesses. This factor was named Clotho, who weaves the thread of life for us, and her sister actually determines how long we live, and then the other sister is the one that is the reason for death. So this new factor is a transmembrane protein that acts somewhat with similar properties for these three FGFs like heparan sulfate does with a lot of the cellular FGFs, in that clothos bind both FGFs and FGF receptor independently. And we don't know if they bind concurrently like heparan sulfate, and we don't know if clothos interact with heparan sulfate yet. But dramatically, these cofactors here, when together in liver and adipocytes at least, can turn a classical receptor, R4, R1, into a non-mitogenic receptor, actually a tumor suppressor in the case of R4, and give it metabolic function instead of all the growth effects, compensatory growth that normal FGFs have done for cellular homeostasis. So again, we believe that this fits with our conformational model, and I don't have time to go into this, but is that we believe that like heparan sulfates, clothos can determine which FGFs bind to this receptor complex in the ectodomain. And some of our preliminary data that I'm not going to give you here today suggests that clothos, by interaction with the ectodomain, can affect which of these signaling molecules come into play, the combination of the molecules that come into play to convert this receptor into another type of collective signal. So I'm going to end it there, and this is the key people here that have contributed to this most recent work, in addition to many years that have, the base was provided for by a lot of Japanese colleagues, a lot of colleagues from People's Republic, as well as some students from within the U.S. and Korea as well. And these are the key players here, where they are now. The and I've introduced them already. Dr. Fen Wang is behind all the mouse genetics here and the technologies. This is the Galveston Island down where we spend some parts of our time there, although last September it took a major storm right on the beach here, but it looks like that normally, and it looks like that now. Here's our June 2008 Center for Cancer and Stem Cell Biology. We're about at this time we were 5 lab groups, and this is the staff as of June 2008 for most of the lab groups. Some are missing here. And to leave you with a final thought, since this is an educational symposium, and we've talked a lot about mentorship and yesterday and education and all this sort of thing, I'll leave you with these two not so original thoughts. Maybe they are. And I don't know if this first one's true. I've heard that it's probably attributed to the best teacher is the one who taught, and the student or teacher never knew that they were being taught. And but Wally McKeehan, his favorite saying, it's not, of course he's not equal to the Buddha saying, is the best teacher in the end is actually the student, and the student is the teacher. And with that, I'll leave you with it and take questions.
Thank you, Wally. I really enjoyed your talk. So your talk reminded me that a long time ago, 20 years ago, we discussed in midnight. Yeah. Okay, now we're going to have an open session to floor. So any question? Okay, Professor Kato.
20 years ago, I worked with Dr. Gospodarovich at the UCSF, and I'm interested in FGF. Your talk is very fantastic, and particularly cloth modulate FGF signaling. And recently, cloth has been shown to bind wind also. And so cloth may bind to FGF and wind and may some other signaling molecules. What is your speculation about the role of cloth to modulate metabolism and cellular homeostasis?
Well, we're working with that, and that's a very good question now. That's the key question of that we're asking is how do clothos come into the FGF receptor complex, which we believe looks this way and uses generally the same signaling pathways to modify that. And so it has two roles. It will allow the receptor complex to react to the endocrine FGFs. They won't work without clotho, the binding. But that's not the only role. Clotho somehow converts this complex in downstream signaling, whether or not you have the endocrine FGFs, to metabolic effects in the right context and not the mitogenic cellular migration and all that effects that FGF1 would have in the absence of clotho, a basic racemic FGF. So I believe, I'm a structural biochemist as well as cell biologist, I believe it's all in that structure mostly. That's where we work. But that's probably not the whole answer. There's modifiers downstream, substrates as you go downstream. The way we're approaching that now is with phosphoproteomics and proteomics in general by model systems of where we add clotho and no clotho. And it's looking very interesting. It does convert the downstream signaling endpoints, even in the same cell type, a typical cultured cell that is naive, that's not a liver cell or a adipocyte. So these can happen. Now back to clothos, they're very interesting. They've been around for a while. And they were first discovered, in fact, the most exciting part is an anti-aging factor. Because if you knock out clothos, the mice age quickly, and they get gray whiskers and all this sort of thing. So the way clothos was first discovered in the metabolic FGF signaling system was it gave some similar phenotypes to the bile acid phenotype that we discovered. So that suggested that maybe clotho is involved with the FGFR4 in the liver. So it's very intriguing if it is wider than FGF signaling, and I think it probably could be to come in and as a transmembrane molecule and interact with these receptor complexes. It has been implicated in calcium transport in some systems and also in insulin receptor activity, so before FGF. So I wouldn't doubt that it does it, and those are key questions of how it does it. The intracellular domain of clotho is very short. We don't have any evidence so far that the intracellular domain will come in and modify that signaling complex that I didn't have time to talk about. In the FGF receptor system, by the way, it's different than EGF. It's unique in that all the substrates seem to be clustered right up near the membrane and at the intracellular domain of the receptor with a single adapter or organizer, which is called FRS2 alpha. And EGFR does not use that. Most of the substrates, I didn't have time to mention it, are distributed up and down the receptor on different phosphotyrosine sites. The FGF receptor is distinguished in that it works right at the membrane through the adapter FRS2 alpha rather than different phosphotyrosine sites down through the receptor. In fact, I think maybe there's only one, the PLC gamma recruitment site, and FRS2 alpha, by the way, does not need phosphorylation of the receptor. It's a membrane-bound adapter that's already attached to the receptor. So we think the receptor complex, our model, is it's all there together already. All the substrates are there. They're all assembled, but they're not in access to the kinase. So we feel that maybe beta-clotho and even heparin sulfate, by having effects in the ectodomain, can modify which of those substrates have access to the kinase. And so some combinatorial set of those common substrates could transfer the signal over to metabolism and away from mitogenesis. That's our idea right now.
Who? So you have a comment on, yeah, okay.
Have you looked at the effect of look at the effect of FGFR4 deficiency on insulin level and insulin sensitivity?
Yes, we have, and I think there's not much effect in our hands. But we haven't pursued that extensively. But it seems like we don't have a lot of effects on insulin signaling in the liver anyway. We've done some of the downstream parameters that people use for insulin signaling. So we did have a negative on that in the liver, but it's not to say it doesn't happen out in the pancreas or somewhere like that.
Okay.
There's got to be a crosstalk eventually, though, because it's metabolism and insulin's the grandfather of metabolic hormones.
Dr. Young.
Dr. McKeehan is a good presentation. I really enjoy it, and it's also good to know that the metabolism role of FGF play, and I'm interested in your study about the FGFR4 rescue study, which can rescue the malfunctioning lipid metabolism, but not rescue the glucose metabolism. And I'm wondering, have you looked at the heparin sulfate, if there's an altered expression of heparin sulfate structure in those tissue? Because we have the studies published in year 2005 and 2006. At that time, I collaborated with medical doctor in OBGYN department. We look at the placenta at high glucose condition, at gestational diabetes DM condition, and at high glucose condition, the heparin sulfate proteoglycans expression is altered. So maybe it's possible that heparin sulfate also play a role in regulate the FGF receptor and FGF structure complex at high glucose condition.
That's a good point, and I don't have the answer to it directly, but there is one feeling from our lab, and others agree with that somewhat, back to the receptor complex, is that clotho does not substitute for heparin sulfate. You still start with the classical receptor complex and effect of heparin sulfate on the metabolic effects of the FGF receptors. It's just that, so I believe clothos now come in to the heparin sulfate FGF receptor complex and modify that. And we don't know how that will occur. So it could well be that happens, but it could still be heparin sulfate because it's a major player. It's not substituted by clothos. Clothos are added on to the heparin sulfate role. So it could well be there. The other aspect of it is that it looks like that the clothos have two roles, and I mentioned that as well. Well, there's three phenomena. One is they have low affinity for heparin sulfate, so they're not required to bind to and activate the receptor. But the receptor that they activate, I believe, still requires heparin sulfate. Heparin sulfate is required for FGF1 and 2 binding, of course, the cellular FGFC. So there's a difference at the binding level, but heparin sulfate is still involved with the receptor complex. And because one of the features I failed to mention is if you look at the endocrine FGFs, it makes sense. That's what gave us a clue early on, is that they are diffusible. They're not trapped by heparin sulfates in the matrix or so, because that would defeat an endocrine factor if the matrix soaked up FGF 21, 19, or so. So they can diffuse through heparan sulfate sites in the matrix, but they still need heparan sulfate at the receptor to act. We do know that.
Okay, Dr. Matsuzaki.
For your presentation. FGFR4's deficiency causes metabolic syndrome or carcinogenesis. Is there any clinical evidence of FGFR4's deficiency in a patient with metabolic syndrome or even hepatoma?
There's not any direct in humans clinically like there is with the 23 vitamin D. See, that emerged out of in vivo because some patients had a mutation in 23, and that was easy. So we don't have that yet for receptor 4. Although it is interesting, but it's complicated. There are not many mutations for receptor 4 like there are developmentally with receptor 1 and 2, for birth defects. But it looks like in some tumors or so there is defects in R4 which abrogate the tumor suppressive effect, see. But we don't know yet about patients or so. But there are patients, humans with hepatomas that have defects in R4 associated with a tumor. But that's not metabolism, that's a tumor effect. So we don't know yet if there's a mutant or a defect in R4 that could directly affect cholesterol to bile acid metabolism or metabolic syndrome. But I think it's possible, but so far there's not one.
One more question. Is there any possibility that some FGF treatment to the metabolic syndrome patient in the future?
Well, as I showed you, it's like all of biology, which is fun to work with, but it's not simple. As I told you, you have a choice. If you want to go treat R4 and FGFs for metabolic syndrome or obesity-related syndromes, you can decrease diabetes by enhancing it, or you can decrease hyperlipidemia, but you're going to aggravate fatty liver, because you don't get both. So you can take your choice. Do you want to have fatty liver, or do you want to have diabetes and hyperlipidemia in the blood? You can't have both with FGF.
Okay, Dr. Shah, please.
My question probably is,
My question, Wally, is probably more confused than anything else. And I'm not sure if it's a correct question also. So maybe you can clarify the question for me, if it is possible. You talked about all these heparan sulfate FGF4 receptor complexes, and I suspect that you have a whole list of substrates available for that, right? There is also a parallel story about EGF, heparan sulfate complexes. The reason I'm thinking this, and that's why I said my question could be confused here, is I was looking at a whole bunch of posters yesterday. And a lot of these people here or elsewhere in the world are doing dental implants. They are doing oral carcinogenesis. And you did show a couple of slides in which you were talking about how FGFR substrates can interact send messages, signaling from epithelium to mesenchyme and vice versa, right? So are these substrates, please help me with the question here, are these substrates common in FGF, heparan sulfate mechanisms, and EGF, heparan sulfate mechanisms? The reason being, a lot of FGFs are like keratinocyte growth factors. They are almost homologous. In fact, they are differently named in different systems. Is there any
to summarize, I think, and I didn't show a slide here of the different elements that distinguish EGF receptor signaling from FGF. Although a lot of endpoints downstream, the classics, ERK, all that, they come up. But the EGF receptor system is not as intimately driven by heparan sulfate as the FGF receptor system. There's no evidence. There is heparin binding EGFs that will affect trafficking through the matrix of a given EGF family member of access to the receptor. That's clear. But there's no real good evidence like we have for the FGF receptor of the second role, that it's an intimately involved with the FGF receptor complex in the pericellular matrix or membrane.
Right.
So those are the two we have to dissect with the FGF receptor. Now, heparan sulfate cofactor with the Wnt signaling is a lot of work there, and it's probably very important, but to my knowledge yet, there's not the intimate structural arguments with the receptor, the ligand signaling, and how it works with Wnt signaling. Although it's there, the matrix is always there and going to affect things either as an electrolyte or a specific oligosaccharide cofactor. Now, the electrolyte effects are large. They're ion exchange polyelectrolytes. They're going to affect proteins and their trafficking in general. And there is a school of thought, in fact, there are glycobiologists, heparan sulfate biologists that believe that would argue with what I presented here today that the structural specificity is not very important in the FGF signaling. It's mainly charge density or ion exchange effects. So there are the ion exchange effect, the charge density effects. They are important, and they're hard to dissect from the structural specificity. Okay. So in EGF receptor, I would speculate that right now there's no evidence for structural specificity, but there is evidence for windows of charge density with heparin binding EGF because it has more affinity electrostatically for the polyelectrolyte. But we're saying here with FGF7, keratinocyte growth factor is the prototype, that there is a very fine intimate association of a oligosaccharide with different sulfate distributions that are less than highest charge that fit into the pocket of FGF7. And that's why you need very high quality protein and well-folded factor. You're getting me off into some of the biochemistry and artifacts, because if you have an unfolded protein, it's going to be an electrolyte if it's poor quality, poor activity. And a lot of people in the FGF system are looking, I think, at artifactual polyelectrolyte effects. They don't have the high quality reagents that are pocket, FGF7 and an oligosaccharide is fitting into that pocket. It's just an ion exchange effect. So you have all these effects, and they're biologically important. There's no doubt about it.
Okay. You didn't mention, may I follow one more question? You didn't connect this with integrins in the system?
Well, there is a connection that is not as strong now as heparan sulfate and